Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. How many of you took this course because of the pretty pictures? I asked my Manet to Matisse class a few months ago. 30 hands went up, with maybe one exception. That's the answer I get year after year. Usually there isn't even one who professes a minority opinion. An interest in history, one student said this semester. Of course, most of us love Impressionism because of the pretty pictures. I'm no exception, although, as you'll see, I like the minority opinion as much, if not more. We love Impressionism because it's so much about the pleasure of looking. Those luscious brushstrokes and splats of tactile pigment, the brightness that makes the unprimed canvas vibrate, pure hues, red, here orange, blues, yellows, greens, mixed mostly with white, the endless variety of atmospheric effects from the reflections of the sun-drenched trees in the water in Monet's Gauss Pond of 1874, which most of you probably know as Duck Pond, to the sprawling cumulus nimbi in Pissarro's River Oise, Pontoise of 1873, both in the Clark collection. Then there are the fabulous scenes of leisure, including Morisot's painting of Eugène Manet and his daughter, actually their daughter, Morisot and Eugène Manet's daughter, in the garden at Bougival in 1881, or Renoir's picture of 1874 entitled The Loge, or La Loge. I tell my students that Impressionism is inseparable from modernity. In fact, this talk could just as well be titled Why I Love Modernity. Baudelaire, in an essay of 1863 called The Painter of Modern Life, defines modernity as, quote, the ephemeral, the fugitive, the contingent, the half of art whose other half is the eternal and the immutable, end quote. In these pictures on the screen, the ephemeral is everywhere apparent. In the movement of water, smoke and mist in Monet's Impression Sunrise, 1872, which gave the name to Impressionism, in the placement of spectators and jockeys, in Degas at the races in the country from 1869, and finally in the blue chill of early light lifting in Pissarro's Hoarfrost of 1873, all of which were shown in the first Impressionist exhibition of 1874, the first of 8. I think it's extremely important to remember that these works were misunderstood and maligned then. About the work on the left, one critic wrote, wallpaper in an embryonic state is more finished than in this seascape. About the painting on the right by Pissarro, Louis Leroy said, those furrows, that frost, but they're palette scrapings placed uniformly on a dirty canvas. And then his companion says, perhaps, but the impression is there, end quote. Impression was a derogatory term, meaning that the work was far too sketchy to be considered finished and to be exhibited at all. I want to suggest that central to the experience of modernist pictures, like modernity itself, is the experience of change. On the screen is a photograph, a modern one, of the Bois de Boulogne, a very large park on the western edge of the center city of Paris. In the center, a map of new streets that were added to the city of Paris between 1851 and 1870. The new streets are marked with the thick black lines. And finally, a caricature on the right, which shows a man known as the Baron Haussmann, originally a prefect, appointed by Napoleon III, who was the self-appointed emperor of the Second Empire from 1851 to 1870. Haussmann was appointed to try to renovate the city of Paris, which had been besieged by several attacks of cholera. So there is Haussmann in his frock coat confronting the enormous specter of disease on the right. So a huge sanitation campaign was undertaken at mid-century. And I would like to suggest that the very aims of Impressionism are inconceivable without the so-called Haussmannization or modernization of Paris. Part of the campaign introduced these new streets and replaced the winding and choking, insalubrious medieval streets, and wide, long boulevards took their place. The Bois, whose lake you see on the left, was part of 400 acres of greenery that was added to the city. You can see there had been very little greenery. Only these areas that look black here were the parks in the center of the city. So the Bois de Boulogne would have been right over here, and its counterpoint on the eastern side, the Bois de Vincennes, would have been on the right. In fact, one might even say that Impressionism is unthinkable without the Haussmannization of Paris, without the renovation of the new city, because the interest that we see in new green spaces in a work like Morisot's early view of Paris from the Trocadero of 1872 on the left, which features that incredible green sward, was in fact enabled by the new presence of greenery in the city of Paris. Similarly, a work like Monet's Boulevard des Capucines, which was painted in 1873 and exhibited in the first Impressionist exhibition the following year, emphasizes those broad, new boulevards. And he does so here not only by taking a view from above, but by organizing these figures almost like in chevron formation, taking us very, very quickly back into space. And at the same time, thank you, he is enlivening the chilly moistness, which you can feel in the air through the gray-blue of the palette, with this very summarily defined bunch of pink balloons. Monet actually was, in fact, criticized here for his figures, which were likened to tongue lickings. And I think that you can see how incredibly reductive they actually are. Just these little dry splots of paint. My favorite detail in this picture is actually right over here on the far right. You have to know these apartment buildings that were constructed under Haussmann that all are about 5 to 6 stories tall with iron balustrades, to realize that sticking out over here on the right is actually a balcony with a very summarily defined top-hatted gentleman leaning out over it. So you can see that a critic might say, only be so good as to tell me what those innumerable black tongue lickings represent. I wanted to actually suggest another aspect of modernity here, and that is the influence of Japanese woodblock prints on artists like Monet and others who were active in Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. This is a print by the artist Hiroshiga, made in the first half of the 19th century, of an evening scene. And I want you to see how Monet has perhaps looked at that enormous, sharp recession into space, tilted up his ground even more, but certainly punctuated that by the rapid recession of figures as they move back, and by these almost columnar stalls on either side, which Monet here reprises as a row of carriages and trees, and by the apartment buildings themselves. It's impossible to think about modernity without developments in industry and technology. And I want to show these two images by Monet that in some ways show how the dissemination, the development of railroads in the first half of the 19th century and continuing into the second radically transformed not only the Parisian landscape, but the rural landscape. So on the top is a painting entitled The Gauss and Lasalle, which is the name of a 19th century railroad station in the northwest of Paris. And below it is a picture done just a few years earlier by Monet called The Railroad Bridge at Argenteuil. Monet went to live in Argenteuil, which was accessible by railroad from precisely that railroad station. He spent 1871 to 1878 living and painting there. And so it's not surprising that he might have painted both the railroad station and the new railroad bridge below. And these have been written about quite compellingly by my friend from graduate school, Paul Tucker, class of '72. No, not 2013, I know. Monet centralizes the enormous iron shed of the new railroad station, which was made possible by iron, which was a new construction material that was much beloved because of its tensile strength, which enabled one to build a huge expanse like that. He focuses on the timeliness of the train traffic, with one train right here in the foreground, one in the middle ground, one actually slightly more recessed here. And the smoke that comes out of the trains melds beautifully with the clouds that you see beyond the open shed here. This might be said to be a rather optimistic view of the wedding of the city and industry. And I think one can say something similar about the painting below, with its beautifully bright blue and white. And the order of the iron bridge on which you see the train, whose clouds of smoke disappear into the clouds above. And in fact, this roaring engine is contrasted with the calm of the scene itself. These two spectator figures looking out over the water, the spans of the iron bridge punctuated by the slow movement of the sailboats below. It was possible to have a very positive attitude toward industry in the decade of the 1870s. But by the end of that decade, it became increasingly hard to maintain that positive viewpoint. And we'll come back to that in a moment. What I want to suggest now is that all of the pictures that we've been looking at are modern. And I want to suggest what that means. It means simply of their own time. But they're also modernist. And that means that they're vanguard in style. I want to turn a little bit to what we mean by that style. Impressionism is rooted in the observation of external phenomena. And usually the pictures are small in scale, they're painted outside, en plein air, and they're transformed, obviously, onto a two-dimensional surface. On the screen are images of a site known as La Grenouillère, which means the frog pond. It was a popular swimming hole about 20 minutes by train outside of Paris. On the top is Monet's version, and on the bottom, Renoir's. And they were painted in 1869, so they're early examples, almost proto-impressionist works. The novelist and critic Émile Zola claimed that, quote, art is nature seen through a temperament. And I think this is a really apposite description. That is, despite the fact that artists are capturing what they see outside them, one can look at these pictures and think back to 1869 when Monet and Renoir were painting side by side and say, they're not the same. They're seen through an individual temperament. Monet's is darker. He's much less interested in the fashion that is of interest to Renoir, for example. Renoir's stroke is much softer. You can see the feathery treatment of the trees and the dappling of the water, whereas Monet's trees above are much more like an impenetrable screen. His dashes in the water are much more assertive. You can see the figures on the little floating dock next to the floating restaurant in both of these. And in Monet, they are the recognizable tongue lickings. Not so in Renoir, who gives us up-to-the-minute fashion. We might take that even further and look at Pissarro painting the same site. That's the floating restaurant on the far right here. But Pissarro is not interested at all in the leisure activity of swimming, which was a new sport in the 19th century. Rather, he focuses on the new incursion of industry by painting a very prominent factory. So what I want to say here is that we can tell the difference between these artists' external visions. I'd like to say that that's not only because of how they paint, but by what they choose to paint. In other words, what I'm saying is that these pretty pictures all have a point of view. We might even say they have a politics. And so I want to suggest that modernity and pretty pictures don't always go hand in hand. Let's look at two instances where the experience of modernity complicates aesthetic pleasure. Case number one, progress. Okay. So we have two visions, rather optimistic, of the incursion of industry and technology into the city. One, Gauss and Lasalle, which you've already seen before, and I'm showing another, the bottom one in the MFA. Monet in 1877 painted 17 versions of different formats and different viewpoints of the Gauss and Lasalle. These are the ones that are reproduced again and again, where I would suggest the central position of the shed and the melding of the clouds and the smoke from the trains and the very clockwork-like positioning of the trains themselves enables us to have a fairly happy relationship to industry and modernity. These are the ones you'll find on calendars, mouse pads, etc. These, however, painted the same year, one hardly sees at all. And I think the reasons are obvious. These are not why we love Impressionism. These show us the dark side of industry and technology, particularly the one on the top with these writhing lines that define the clouds, the rather pollutant palette that he uses here, this disturbing eyeball-like position of the signal over here and the higher one to the right, and the sort of burning eyeball-like qualities of the embers powering the train itself. And all of this rather unbright, murky color suggests that Monet was now seeing the underbelly of progress. And in fact, after this group of paintings of Gauss and Lasalle, Monet never painted either Gauss and Lasalle again, nor the city of Paris again. Case number 2, the beautiful woman phenomenon. On the left, Renoir's La Loge, and on the right, Mary Cassatt's Woman in Black at the Opera. We tend to see a hierarchy in Impressionist painting, in which women function as eye candy. And Renoir is the typical example. I could find thousands of pictures that show the woman on display, seated in front of the man, in this case, holding demurely a small little golden pair of binoculars, which she's not using. Whereas the man has this honker set of binoculars, and he's using them to look around at the other people in the other boxes, while his own feasibility and desirability are being broadcast by the beautiful woman wearing a little too much makeup, so probably a woman for hire in front of him. Okay. So her beauty and fashionableness redound upon her male escort. And men were routinely, in Impressionist iconography, accorded the privilege of looking as well as the privilege of painting. Mary Cassatt, born in Philadelphia, my hometown, gives us an extremely rare exception to this rule. In Woman in Black at the Opera, she depicts a relative and confounds the accepted convention, has her no-nonsense woman looking straight out, and in a way that is particularly delightful, pokes fun at the man ogling from a balcony across from her. This is a rather extraordinary picture by Belle Morisot, entitled The Wet Nurse from 1881. And while you look at it, I want to, in fact, suggest that the limitations on women and the fact that they were not expected to be professional painters at this time could actually lead sometimes to rather radical new iconography. And that's the case with The Wet Nurse, which shows a woman that she hired suckling her newborn daughter, Julie. The only Impressionist exhibition she missed showing in was right after the birth of her daughter. She showed at 7 out of 8 of them. While you look at this picture, I want to tell you a little story. The death certificate of Belle Morisot recorded her profession, despite her having shown at all these exhibitions, as none, sans profession. Although the following year, her peers, Monet and Renoir among them, organized an exhibition of 400 of her works. She obviously occupied a can't-win position as an attractive yet respectable woman who was also a professional painter. And that led her to make this picture. Her privilege, class privilege, enabled her to take the time by hiring a servant so that she could paint. And when she makes this picture, I want you to look at the drawing, that incredibly powerful, squiggly, reductive contour, all of this kind of cross-hatching in the dress and in the landscape. The umbrella miraculously almost disappears. And then the face, just that thin line for a mouth, the light with the two nostrils, and these slits for eyes, different colored eyebrows, I might note. Really radical painting. But in fact, women extraordinarily disadvantaged as painters. And I want to say that the experience of change that I've suggested characterizes modernity can be applied not only to pictures, but to pedagogy. Let's look at Manet's Olympia, which caused a firestorm in 1865 when it was exhibited at the official salon. Even though Manet was considered the father of Impressionism, greatly admired by all the artists we've looked at thus far, he never showed with them. What I learned about the picture in graduate school was not so different from what Émile Zola, a staunch advocate of Manet's scandalous picture, wrote more than 100 years earlier. He said, Manet wanted to paint a nude, and he added a bright patch of flowers. Then he needed a contrast, so he added the servant and the black cat, which you can barely see over here in the right corner. You can see its eyes right there. Cat, as I think you know, not a dog. Symbol of sexuality, not fidelity. In case you're sort of missing the point here. Okay, so contemporaries in 1865 would have compared this picture to a work like the Alexandre Cabanel Below, which was actually painted in 1863, the very same year as Manet's Olympia. And so I would have known all of this, and I'll rehearse this for you in a moment. But I think the point I want to make is that when I began teaching Manet's Olympia, I was already a feminist. But when a woman of color first sat in my class in the early 1880s, yeah, I have been teaching for a really long time. And clearly you're all a lot younger because you got that mistake. Okay, in the 1980s, I remember distinctly asking myself how I would teach the painting with that black servant offering the white prostitute flowers from an admirer. What would I do if a woman of color were in my class, as she was for the first time in the 1980s? In other words, this was one of many times I asked myself the question, how do we as educators stay attuned to change in our own social experience? How do developments in historiography affect pedagogy? How do feminism, critical race studies, masculinity studies, queer studies, and more affect art history? Well, they don't always, of course. One can avoid them, just as Monet turned his back on the factories at Argenteuil in the 70s. But I can't avoid them. So in teaching Manet's Olympia in the early 1980s, I started with the usual. Manet painted not a nude, but a naked woman. She lacked the microtonal modeling, invisible hand of the artist that we see in the rendering of the flesh of The Birth of Venus by Cabanel. Look at how bright and chalky and even dirty. Look at the outline of the fingers in the Manet. That kind of drawing, unthinkable. Look at the contour line, which is broken, discontinuous, not the sensual, continuous serpentine line that we find in Cabanel. And she certainly is not Venus, born on the waves. She's a scrawny working-class prostitute who, instead of lowering her gaze or shielding her eyes, so we get our free cookies, as it were, or some of us do, she is staring out at the viewer and not, almost no visible hair. She actually has a shock of auburn hair over here on the left, but certainly not this cascade of long, sensualized hair that you see in the Cabanel. She's staring straight at the viewer. Instead of a faithful dog, she has a black cat and a black servant. I then mixed in the contemporary criticism, which compared the figure of Olympia to a gorilla, and likened her left hand, covering her pubic area, to a toad. The critics were clearly outraged. And then I started to think about the servant, who is not just a tonal contrast, but part of a tradition of depicting sensuality outside the West, which is inscribed racially. So, for example, I looked at a painting by Ingres, on whom I'd written a book, which shows a very fair-skinned woman in the foreground, clearly the woman on display, like Olympia, with a slightly darker-skinned woman playing the lute. And if you can look back into the shadows, you can actually see that there's a completely dark-skinned figure of a eunuch between the red columns. So racial difference used to heighten the sensual, and certainly to take us, even in a picture which is set in a boudoir in Paris, to a place of imperialist fantasies. And I might point out that Olympia's maid is wearing a Caribbean hairscarf, and that in the late 18th century, around the time of the French Revolution, France was very much in the Caribbean. So Manet here is playing with the modern, and he's also playing with France outside. We might look at another example that I think came to the fore in the 1990s when masculinity studies and even queer studies came into prominence. We had been used to seeing hundreds and hundreds of pictures like those on the right by Degas, women at the toilette. But we almost never saw, because there are probably about 3 of them in the entire history of 19th century modernist painting, of men at their toilette. And this is a painting by Cassatt, a contemporary of Degas. And he showed in at least 5 of the Impressionist exhibitions, and this picture raised the question, what happens when a man is in a domestic interior that is normally reserved for women? What happens when he's shown naked and vulnerable, seen from the back? Something which had been naturalized with women, as it was in Degas, gets shaken up here when a male is eroticized and objectified. Now, for my conclusion, I want to focus on the fact that none of what we've seen thus far prepares us for what happens to Impressionism by the time of the last Impressionist exhibition in 1886, or to those artists who came to be associated with the group. Monet went from Argenteuil in the 70s, increasingly further out to Verneuil and then to Giverny. And I'm showing you his garden at Argenteuil in 1872 and his garden at Giverny in 1901. You can see that he's gotten rid of this path and gotten rid of a lot of detail. His son rolling a hoop, the little pot with the plant. Even the house is obscured. There's no real patio, it's just the path. The house is up here, and the trees. In his late work, he's moving very distinctly towards a more reductive definition of space and form. Monet's the one who guarded the Impressionist flame, and in doing so, he underscores the very tension my students experience when I start talking about modernity. Nearly 30 years separate these works, and you see how reduced they are, and that's only emphasized by the close cropping. I want to suggest that modernity is in tension with pretty pictures. Pretty pictures fit uneasily with changes tied to industrialization, urban sprawl, and empire. And the garden does not present that problem. Monet had to, in order to continue making pretty pictures, to withdraw more and more from the modern experience. In 1891, at Giverny, he begins his first series of grain stacks, which he would find at the end of summer on the edges of his substantial property. He was already a highly recognized and fairly comfortable painter. Although he reduces his compositions to one or two fixed objects, and he organizes them in stacked zones, the sky, the mountains and houses, and the ground on which the grain stack sits. This is winter, this is sunset below. He remains true to the Impressionist agenda of pure hue, unprimed canvas, the artist's hand, the flattening of the picture plane. But now it's about the distillation of the ephemeral, the fugitive, the contingent, to go back to Baudelaire, and to focus on the quintessential experience of light and weather, played out on a focused motif. These works are begun en plein air and revised in the studio. And here are three series: the grain stacks, the poplars, Rouen Cathedral, this picture in the Clark from 1894 on the right. The work becomes less about what he saw outside and more about what he feels when seeing it. He takes us further and further away from the metropolis, finally asking us to come away with him to a world entirely of his own creation at Giverny, to the water garden he constructs with a footbridge modeled after the Japanese woodblock print by Hiroshiga. You can see that wooden span here, which Monet adopts in this picture done in the early 20th century. And you can see a photograph from around that time of the wooden bridge and one of the weeping willows above the water pond. I didn't ask my students this spring why they love Impressionism until I showed Monet's series, from which the dark side of modernity seems to be banished in favor of a private, sensual world. In the water lilies, 1905 on the top, 1919 on the bottom. Even gravity is abrogated. We no longer know what's on top and what's on the bottom. Is this a shadow cast by a tree, or might it be grasses growing up from the water at the bottom of the pond? These seem to be on top, but these forms that might be below, that might be reflections on top, have just as much weight. Solid and void disappear. Gravity disappears. In these glorious, very focused images, a politics of retreat inheres. After the war, Monet received a commission from the Prime Minister of France for the French nation. Georges Clemenceau is shown here on the right with the bearded Monet, with the commission in progress here, somewhere between 1919 and 1926. Here you see one of the rooms in the Orangerie on the west side of the Tuileries Gardens in Paris. Rooms constructed, two of them, in elliptical form, so that the spectators standing inside one of them or each of them could be literally inside the water garden depicted by Monet. And that is our experience, experiencing the pond with him. Here you see it in color, rather refurbished in the photograph above, and the scene here called Setting Sun in the first of these two rooms. It's hard not to savor the enduring appeal of these pictures as heirs of modernity. And we are those heirs to a modernity in ever more complex forms. I'd like to leave you with the suggestion that is why we all love them. It's why we love them, and I think that's why my students do too. Thank you very much.